Good afternoon. Welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Robert Daly. I'm the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. And together with the Asia program, led by Bob Hathaway, we're very happy to be able to sponsor this program for Professor Bill Callahan. Many of you have probably been to the Wilson Center before. In case you haven't, you might be interested to know this building, this institution, is actually the living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, who requested that an institution be set up where international scholars could come to Washington to do their research and to inform policy. And if you haven't been before, there's a little museum to Wilson down in the basement. I encourage you to, the ground floor. I encourage you to see it after you leave. We have the top hat and the pince-nez, and you've seen the hat and the pince-nez. You've pretty much seen the former president. So please stop by if you haven't seen it before. We're very happy to have as our speaker today Professor William Callahan, who teaches international relations at the London School of Economics. He joined the faculty there just in September of this year. Is that right? Prior to that, beginning in 2005, he had been the chair of international politics at the University of Manchester, and more importantly, was a Woodrow Wilson Center Fellow here in 2007-2008. Professor Callahan is the author of 7 books, including Contingent States, Greater China and Transnational Relations, which came out in 2004, and China, the Pessimist Nation, which came out in 2009. He also co-edited in 2012, China Orders the World, Normative Soft Power and Foreign Policy. And then most recently, as you probably saw on your way in, he is the author of China Dreams, 20 Visions of the Future. And we are selling these books at the door. I encourage you to pick one up if you didn't on the way in, then inspired by this lecture on your way out. It covers a whole range of very important issues which have been much in the news recently and also been written about by a number of other prominent scholars. Ran Zongzi, one of China's major America watchers and vice president of the China Institute of International Studies, spoke this past August at the All China Journalists Association. And he said, "No one in the world will try to contain China, and no one in this world is capable of containing China." Fair enough, but statements like this, and there are many statements like this, do raise questions, at least in the minds of many Americans and people from other countries. What is it that China plans to do that any other nation, and the United States in particular, might wish to contain? These statements beg such questions. The big question, what does China want? What is China becoming? And when I pose this to Chinese friends, they usually, quite reasonably, say, well, what does America want? What is it that we want from each other in light of our desires for ourselves? This is very difficult to figure out. Are Chinese and Americans' desires, ambitions, compatible? Or is it the case, as it often seems to be, that what China really wants is for us to just get out of the way, particularly in the Western Pacific, while what America wants sometimes seems to boil down to continuing to have our way, especially in the Western Pacific. So Chinese have been asking and trying to answer these questions now for well over a century, not primarily for the sake of better relations with the United States, we should point out, but for China's own sake. And this quest for answers received new impetus from Xi Jinping's prominent musings on what he calls the China Dream. And I assume that most of you here today have been following this discourse since Xi Jinping first launched it at the National Museum. Professor Callahan's book helps us, I think, to take the essential step of understanding China from its own points of view, plural points of view. China Dreams demonstrates that there is a range of opinion in China about the direction the country should take and about what it means to be Chinese now that China is becoming wealthy and powerful. China's discourse on these topics is not monolithic. It's very rich, and it is rapidly changing. We are delighted to have Professor Callahan with us today to guide us through this in person, and we look forward to a discussion with you when he has concluded his remarks. Thank you. Professor Callahan.
Is there a way to do the PowerPoint slides from over there, or?
That is an excellent question.
I could just.
You could also, you can nod to me and I can click. Whatever you think works for you, or it's fine to deliver your remarks from here.
Yeah, well, no, I'll just sit down
Okay.
here, unless, I guess. Sorry to do this housekeeping in front of everyone. I'm just put this over here. Well, thank you. Thank you, Robert, for that kind introduction. I feel like you've already kind of done my work for me.
That's because I read your book.
Thank you. And I want to thank you for inviting me and facilitating my coming here, and also Bob Hathaway, who was my host when I was here in 2007, 2008. So it's always great to be back at the Wilson Center. Today what I'm going to do is, I actually like sitting down here, if that's okay. Today what I would like to do is just raise some of the issues that I discuss in the book, and then kind of talk about how the China Dream idea and concept has developed since I finished the book and it was published. Some of the things I say might sound very kind of extreme or critical about China, but I guess what I'm going to be doing today is not giving my own view of China, but try to tell you about certain conversations that are going on in China. So when I say China wants this, China wants that, I'm not necessarily reflecting my own personal view, but I'm kind of giving you a sense of the conversations. As I say in the book, it's a way of eavesdropping on conversations that are going on in China. And I find that a lot of the Chinese language conversations are different from the ones that we usually have in English. So that's, I guess, my added value, is to kind of look at what's going on in the kind of Chinese universe of discussion. Now, let's see if this works. Sorry? Oh, am I blocking something? Okay. Sure.
You have the remote, Bill?
I got the remote.
Okay.
It's fine. I can go here.
Me too?
You're blocking one of the members of the Politburo Standing Committee, and we have to make sure they're all well represented. So, of course, the China Dream became popular almost 12 months ago when Xi Jinping talked about his China Dream on November 29th, 2012. And he did it, what he said is his China Dream is the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And so it's a kind of very vague, very positive, aspirational dream of just China being successful, which is, quite interesting. But I think it's actually even more important where he expressed his dream, because he expressed it at the National Museum of China, and he expressed it at the end of the main exhibit about modern Chinese history, The Road to Rejuvenation. And this is an exhibit about the tortured history that China had since the Opium War started in 1840. So it's a very kind of peculiar kind of nationalism, a very reactive nationalism. And so I think it's important to know where he talked about this. It's also important to see that he's there with the leadership of China. These are the 7 guys, and they are all men, who lead China, the Politburo Standing Committee. So I think that because of this context and because of the people that he was with when he expressed his China Dream, that means that it's very important, that it's much more than some kind of empty slogan. It's a slogan or a TIFA that has been kind of elaborated on for the past year. Now, people assume that the China Dream is a new idea. A lot of a lot of journalists said, "Oh, this is a new idea. Maybe he got it from Tom Friedman, because Tom Friedman had some article in the New York Times the previous month." But what this doesn't recognize is that people have been talking about the China Dream a lot for the past 5 years or so. And what they've been doing is these public intellectuals and some officials have been responding to what they see and what they call a values crisis, that China has had this moral vacuum since 1978 with reform and opening. Before 1978, they had values, socialist values. Since then, with kind of the increasing liberalization of markets, the idea in China is that they don't have any values anymore. And so what is quite curious is that amongst these public intellectuals, it seems that nobody's happy. Now, of course, when we're looking at China from the outside, we see it's wonderfully successful, great economic growth, wonderful rise in standard of living, great decrease in poverty levels. But when you listen to debates inside China, you see that there's a lot of unhappiness about how things are. And this is, again, the fallout from economic reform. And there's a certain phrase that is used in China called youhuan, which some people translate as patriotic worrying or worrying mentality. And this is actually an ancient phrase that has been used in poetry and literature. But what is curious is that now this sense of patriotic worrying is characterizing how people who are economists, who are political scientists, who are media professionals, and international relations scholars, they're all talking about patriotic worrying. They all think that there's something wrong with China, and it's their job as an intellectual to solve China's problems. So what was interesting to me is to see how this patriotic worrying was going on across the political spectrum in China. So you have some soldiers, some kind of ultra-militarist, ultra-nationalist soldiers talking about patriotic worrying. And then you also have liberals who want to have a constitution and rule of law in China, also talking about patriotic worrying and worrying about the direction that China's going in. And then there's people on the new left in China who want to have more socialism, a greater role of the state. They're all talking about this in a similar way. So in the book, what I try to do is to give you a sense of the conversations that are going on between these various groups by looking at people from specific places, like from the military, from academics, from economic development, from kind of views of society, but also looking at it from across a political perspective of kind of from the ultra-leftist to the centrist to what you could call the rightists. And what I found is that there's just so much discussion going on about the future of China in what I call pop futurology. So there are numerous books have been published in China over the past 4 or 5 years that talk about China in 2025 or China 2030 or the future of China. And they're all just dreaming about what China should be as a way of criticizing how China is now. So that's the dynamic I'm looking at, is not necessarily saying that I'm not predicting what China is going to be like in 2030. What I'm doing is looking at how these Chinese intellectuals are talking about the future can tell us a lot about what's going on in China right now and the kind of political choices and the political debates that are going on in China right now. So let's see if this works. Excellent. So we usually think of the China dream as a national dream, but it's also an individual dream. So this is the Chinese Idol. It's from the American song contest, American Idol. It was launched in China. I mean, they've had many song contests in China, but this one was launched last May. And what was very curious is that it talks about the China dream as an individual dream with a little luck and talent and some hard work, you can achieve your goal. Now in Chinese, 中国梦之声, it's the voice of the China dream. And what I found really interesting is how this voice of the China dream was actually part of the propaganda campaign outlined by the Communist Party's Central Propaganda Department, that they had various memos, one of which was published in a newspaper about how they're going to plan, how they're going to roll out the China Dream discourse. And in addition to publishing handbooks to give to party cadres about how to understand the China Dream, they also said, we're going to have singing contests about the China Dream, and we're going to have summer camps to promote the China Dream. We're going to have big big research projects to roll out the China Dream. So I thought this was an interesting way that the party state in China is trying to convince the public of a particular kind of China Dream that it's an individual dream, but it's also a national dream. Let's see. So just to go back to what I was talking about a moment ago, I guess this is for the academics in the audience. If there are any, I don't know if this is more of a public policy forum. What I'm trying to do is to think about how civil society works in China in a slightly different way than people think about it now. Most analysts of Chinese politics say that there's an official view on one hand and a dissident view on the other hand, and that a lot of the academics don't have much freedom to talk about and analyze the things that they want to talk about and analyze. And what I found is that for various reasons, a new space has opened up in the past 4 or 5 years that has allowed a lot of public space in the media, on the web, in newspapers, on TV talk shows, for intellectuals to talk about their view of the future. And they're acting like public intellectuals, although they can act like public intellectuals in a more liberal society because they don't have total freedom. So I came up with this other term, citizen intellectuals, to kind of get a sense of how they have to work within certain constraints. They don't have total freedom, but they have what one novelist said, they have 90% freedom to talk about what they want. And rather than thinking about, oh, they're still censored, what about that 10% that's missing? In this book, I try to focus on the 90% of freedom that they have. And what I found is that a lot of these new intellectuals who are trying to get the ear of the new leadership, because a new leadership took control in China last year and earlier this year, these new citizen intellectuals have been trying to promote a different vision of China's future. And they've come up with various ways of talking about it. Probably the most famous one is the China model, kind of China model of development, but it's also a model of economics and politics and society. There's also the China dream. People have been talking about the China dream specifically. Now we talk about the China path. And what I've been doing by looking at these citizen intellectuals is trying to see how influence works in China. I mean, in the past, everything was done behind closed doors, and that university academics didn't really have much influence. And it was just up to officials to make policy decisions in China. What's happened in the past 5-10 years is a new breed of kind of foreign policy actors and domestic policy actors has emerged, who not only try to influence public policy through the back door or through kind of secret meetings with the leadership, but they're also trying to influence Chinese policy by going on TV and writing on blogs and doing Twitter and doing social media and kind of promoting their view of China and their view of the future by trying to encourage public opinion and get public opinion on their side. And to me, this was a very new and exciting way of looking at things. I mean, I guess if you're used to Western politics, it's not that new, but in China, it seems to be quite new and quite exciting. And it made me think of a line from I Ching's poem. I Ching is Ai Weiwei's father, the famous painter or famous artist in China. His father was an even more famous poet, communist poet. And in 1941 at Yan'an, the communist base where Mao was, Ai Ching wrote a poem called Mao Zedong. And it started off by just praising Mao as this wonderful person. And the last line of the poem is the one that I find most interesting, because it says, the new slogan determines the new direction or the new political direction. And that's actually what I've been looking at, is how slogans, whether it's the China model or the China dream or the China path, are actually much more than a slogan. They really are giving us a sense of the direction that China is going in. And I guess what happened is that, what I wanted to say is that because I was kind of listening closely and reading closely what people were talking about, I was able to, in a way, predict the new slogan, predict that the China Dream would be the Xi Jinping slogan. Okay. So what I'll do now is just a quick summary of some of what I call the pre-official China Dream. So these are the China Dreams before Xi Jinping talked about the China Dream last November. And the first one is probably the most famous. It's that the China Dream is not this kind of airy-fairy dream of success, or it's not individual success. That no, actually the first China Dream was a military dream. And it's a dream of China having a strong military, that to be a strong nation, China just can't just be an economic power like Japan, that China has to be a political power, and to be a political power, China has to have firepower, has to have a strong military. And Colonel Liu Mingfu came out with this book called The China Dream in 2010. It was republished earlier this year, kind of to great acclaim. And it's a very interesting book. I'll come back and talk about it a little later, because even though it has a very blunt message that China has to race to the finish to beat the US, to become the next superpower, some of its analysis is actually quite nuanced. We'll get back to that in a moment. The second China Dream that really struck me was the dream of the New Left. So the New Left in China are people who are critical of economic reform, or trying to kind of roll back some of the liberalization in China. They're accused of being Maoists, but I don't think they really are Maoists in that sense. They're very 21st century kind of New Left statists, is what I would call them. And so what they're pushing is a development model that is more state-centric. They want to have make the state-owned enterprises in China more important. They are very critical of civil society. They say civil society is a plot hatched by Westerners to undermine Chinese unity. So it's a very curious situation where public intellectuals like Huang Gang and Pan Wei, who are kind of famous in Chinese circles, how they're using civil society, they're using the media and websites and the internet to criticize civil society. So it's a very interesting thing. They say that we should have, or China should have, a popular society where there is no division between state and society. The third China Dream that I looked at was what you could call the Chinese, or the Confucian Dream. And this is kind of a China Dream and a world dream. And I've been reading this philosopher Zhao Tingyang for about 5-6 years. And he wrote a book originally published in 2005 called The Under Heaven System, or the Tianxia System. And he's a philosopher, so we have to take it with a grain of salt how influential he is. He was kind of talking about a hierarchical world order where China's at the center and other countries are on the periphery, that China's a moral leader, a moral force that has to govern through virtue. But what is very important to note is that it's not just this philosopher talking about it. This whole notion of a Chinese-style world order has really taken off in Beijing and Shanghai in particular, amongst international relations specialists, amongst academics, and it also gets some play amongst officials. So I guess the conclusion that I draw from this is that this is sort of the Chinese view of the future world, that they don't like the Westphalian system or the United Nations system. Even though they're still a socialist country, they're more interested in a hierarchical system than an equal system. And that's one of the themes that keeps coming out again and again in the past few months in writings, especially from Beijing. Now, the last pre-official China dream I want to talk about is the liberal dream. Now, liberal in China is it's kind of a fuzzy concept. Liberal often means people who believe that there should be a stronger rule of law in China, more freedoms. and there are certain publications that are seen as more liberal publications, and I guess the most famous one is Southern Weekend from Guangzhou in southern China. And what was to me very important is that in 2010, which is the same time that the military China Dream book came out, in 2010, Southern Weekend started giving out China Dreamer Awards. So now they have this annual award given out often at a grand ceremony at Peking University that kind of awards between 5 and 10 people for being China dreamers. And in the book, I talk about the kind of the first China dreamer, who was actually a Taiwanese woman named Long Ying-tai. And she gave a speech at Peking University in 2010 that was sort of this alternative China dream, not this state-centric China dream, a dream of the people rather than of the party state, that was published on the web in China and seemed to be quite influential for a time. Now, what happened actually is Ms. Long was appointed the Minister of Culture in Taiwan a year and a half ago. So that, to me, is a very interesting thing, how people go back and forth from being a citizen intellectual, because before that, she was just a writer in residence at Hong Kong University. She's known as an essayist who publishes in newspapers in mainland China. So she went from being this sort of cultural critic to being a government official. And that's one of the other things I look at in the book, is how people move back and forth from being dissidents to being citizen intellectuals to being officials. And again, okay. So those are the kind of 4 main pre-official China dreams. Like a good futurologist, I should talk about trends. In the book, I examine about 20 to 25 dreams. My title actually is a lie. I don't talk about just 20, but it made more sense rhetorically. Oh my, people can quote me on that. So what I do is look about 20 to 25 dreams and dreamers. And first thing I want to underline is that there's a wide variety of dreams, as I guess I just mentioned in the 4 main groups of dreams. But there are some general trends. The first one is kind of the method of how people think about the future. And so this shift from the 1970s, when it was still a Maoist period, to the 1990s, when China was opening and the rise of nationalism in China, to the 2010s, to now, when I think it's China going global in a much more organized way. And the method has shifted between these three different decades. So it started out from scientific socialism, and then in the 1990s it went to social science. And then now there's this shift from seeing things in terms of kind of a scientific analysis of the situation to see political problems as moral issues, as cultural issues. That even the most hardcore social scientists I know in China, they're now talking about values. There's an enormous kind of increase in discussion of values. And I think that's an important shift. The second trend is about identity. And people have talked about the shift in identity from communism to nationalism, but I think it's a little different. I think that what we're moving from is not just from socialism to nationalism, but socialism to statism. And I guess I'll come back to that in a moment. That a lot of the values that we're talking about that are called Chinese civilizational values are promoting a certain kind of Chinese civilization, that they're kind of a strong state, a hierarchical state that values stability and unity. And lastly, the trend that I'll look at is in international relations. In the 1970s, they were still having this revolutionary internationalism, where Mao said that he would help various anti-imperialist revolutions around the world. And then in the 1990s, it shifted to China's national interests. Now what I see going on is this shift from this national interest, which is very easy to understand, is very kind of understandable in terms of Western concepts. There's this shift to what some people call Chinese exceptionalism. That China, and you can compare it to American exceptionalism, of course, but since this China has this different way of thinking, different way of acting, different way of working in the world, that foreigners either can't understand or have a very hard time understanding. So one of the intellectuals in China that I was following, Xu Jilin, is a historian in Shanghai, and he was talking about these general trends a couple years ago, and he said that what they show is what he calls a collective right turn, especially among China's left-wing intellectuals, that they've gone to the right in the sense of they're not promoting equality anymore, they're promoting statism, a very strong state. And he says further that it's sort of what do cool intellectuals do in China. In the 1980s, it was cool to be a liberal. In the 1990s, it was popular to be a nationalist. And then in the 21st century, the most popular and sort of the most popular thing is to be a statist, which again I think is it's a very good analysis of what's going on. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about the China dream and the American dream. Actually, a lot of these books that talk about the China dream start off by talking about the American dream, and that shouldn't be surprising because the American dream is really a global phenomenon that most people outside the U.S. have some inkling of what the American dream is. And what has happened in the past few months is that there's been this very kind of strong and vibrant discussion about, what is the difference between the American dream and the China dream. This is going on in publications in China. And what it boils down to is that it's American individuals versus the Chinese nation. That the American dream is about freedom and prosperity, whereas the China dream is about order and prosperity. That the American dream is often presented in these Chinese publications in what I see as a very narrow way, as this crass materialism, as being rich and famous, of a big house and a big car. And that's more about quantity than quality of life. And so this kind of shallow materialism, which a lot of people in the US as well as in China see as characteristic of the American dream, actually it strikes a chord amongst a lot of the new elite in China. That when The Great Gatsby came out, the film The Great Gatsby came out last spring, it was really popular in China. And Evan Osnos, the New Yorker correspondent who was in Beijing at that time, he wrote a blog that kind of described how Chinese people were relating to The Great Gatsby, that they felt that they were in a similar situation of kind of new riches, new wealth, but wondering about the moral and ethical situation of their country, about whether there was this moral vacuum. Now, I think that the American dream is actually a bit more nuanced than this crass materialism. And I studied the American dream for the first time as I was writing this book on the China dream, and I found that it's actually much more nuanced in terms of it's not just about material gain, but it's about freedom and equality. And if you trace the notion of the American dream back a few centuries, it's about religious freedom when the Pilgrims came to America. It's about political freedom with the Revolutionary War and the Declaration of Independence. And even since then, that the American dream of equality and freedom keeps being reinvoked. So 50 years ago, last summer, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous speech, his I Have a Dream speech. That was very directly invoking the American dream. And So what I was seeing is how this American dream can be used as a critical tool to criticize the status quo in the U.S. So that's the sort of thing we see a lot now. If you look at publications that talk about the American dream, most of them are not a triumphalist thing like, yay, we Americans, we've got it all. It's usually, why aren't we achieving the American dream? Or this generation will not be able to get the American dream. And it's always in a, presented in a, what I see as a critical light. Whether you're on the left or the right, this idiom of the American dream is used to criticize American politics. And this actually has a very long tradition from the very beginning in the 1620s. The talk of the American dream was already critical of whether people were up to the task of kind of moving to America. So it's not a recent thing. It's kind of a characteristic of the whole discourse of the American dream. Now, I think that the China dream can be used as a critical tool as well. That, as I said, there's this literary term from ancient Chinese, Youhuan, that people use as patriotic worrying or worrying mentality. And as I said, it's not just used by poets and kind of literary scholars. It's actually used by military intellectuals a lot. If you search for this term on the internet, you'll find out that you get a lot of hits from the top military kind of commentators in China. So it's Colonel Liu Mingfu, but also very prominent people like General Luo Yuan use the way of thinking about China and its future. If you go back to Liu's book, The China Dream, the military dream that I talked about a moment ago, he's very interesting because this is, at the end of his book, he doesn't give a triumphalist view of, rah, China is beating America. He's much more self-reflective and says that actually American declinism, or Americans talking about the decline of America, is a really interesting thing, and that he says that Americans have talked about their decline 8 times since World War II, but actually America has never declined. So his reasoning is that to stop a decline, you have to talk about a decline. And he says, unfortunately, in China, people don't talk about China collapse. The China collapse is only talked about by foreigners. So he says that in China, we need to have some more homegrown China collapse theory. And the purpose is not to help China collapse, but to stop a collapse. So this is his curious logic of the need to have a more critical view of China's role in the world. And this actually kind of happened in January 2013. So Xi Jinping first mentioned his China dream on November 29th of last year. And then, according to the State Language Commission in Beijing, the China dream became the hottest word in the nation in 2012. So in 31 or 32 days, it rose to the top of kind of important words. And so people were starting to pay attention to it very early. And there was this editorial written in the Southern Weekend magazine, the same one that gives out the China Dreamer Awards. It was a New Year's editorial in January 2013. And it said, "Our China dream is a dream of constitutionalism." And what I saw here is this using the dream as a critical tool within China, that they're challenging Xi Jinping's notion of the China dream as a strong nation and a strong party state by saying, no, we need the rule of law. We need to take we already have a constitution. It's a great constitution. We need to take it seriously and have it kind of determine the direction of Chinese society. Unfortunately, this editorial, this New Year's editorial, never made it into print. It was censored and rewritten before it could be published. It was leaked onto the web and caused a pretty big controversy among journalists demanding that they shouldn't be censored. And to me, it was very interesting because it sort of sparked this debate about constitutionalism in China that's still going on today, 11 months later, that especially over last summer, there was this very kind of vociferous back and forth in the press about whether China needed to have constitutionalism as the rule of law, and then other people were saying, no, we need to make sure the party's in control. And this debate doesn't seem to have been resolved yet. So to me, this is a good example of how the China Dream concept is being used as a critical tool within the PRC, even right now. I have a feeling, though, that this notion of the China Dream as a critical tool won't last that long. That my sense is that in China, when the party leadership makes an idea into a slogan, it actually kills it as a critical tool to a large extent. We saw this with Hu Jintao talking about harmonious society and harmonious world in 2004, 2005. And I think since then, no serious scholar really talks about harmony anymore, which is a shame, because harmony is a very interesting concept in China. And so what has happened is that in the past 5-10 years, harmony has turned into an object of ridicule. So there's all sorts of puns on harmony and river crabs and things like that on the web. And so on the one hand, it's become a very vacuous notion, harmony, kind of harmonious trains, harmonious this, harmonious that. On the other hand, it's become an object of satire, which satire is interesting, but I don't ultimately see it as being very political. It doesn't actually tell us about where China should go. It just tells us about where China should not go. And I'm afraid that the same thing is going to happen with the China Dream. And we already see the satire of the China Dream in this editorial cartoon. So there's, as you can see, there's in the middle a naked, middle-aged, fat, balding Chinese man asleep on a bed. And all around, all around him are, a couple thousand people watching him. And what is going on here is that these people are doing a study tour of the new the new model. So in the 1970s, you did a study tour of a village for economic reform. In the 1960s, you went to a different village or different factory to find out the new direction. Here, people are doing a study tour of the China Dream, of looking at this guy dreaming. So this is the sort of satirical way of understanding it. I guess as a study session on the China Dream model. And so some people say that, like with the harmonious world, the China Dream will become ultimately become a zombie concept. And a zombie, I guess, means that zombies are everywhere in a good zombie film. They're everywhere, they're a threat, but they have no brain, so they're vacuous. So that's what's happened with a lot of the harmony talk, that it's everywhere, but it has very little meaning. And I'm actually afraid that the China Dream is also going to become a zombie concept. I could talk more about the China Dream and the American Dream, but I think I'll just stop here and we can have some Q&A.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Bill. I would like to ask two quick questions to kick it off before opening it up. First, your final remarks. Why afraid? Why afraid that this would become a zombie concept? What is the danger there? Why is that undesirable? But then perhaps a more difficult question to ask and maybe to answer. Chinese exceptionalism, which you already described. Does China's sense of exceptionalism limit its ability to imagine certain kinds of futures for itself? I was struck in reading your book, you have a sentence, if we widen our view of activism beyond dissidents to include citizen intellectuals, the bloggers, novelists, filmmakers, scholars, and artists who are thinking up new ways to be Chinese, then we can see the enormous energy and optimism of people who are busy building the future in China. And as you say, these people are thinking up new ways to be Chinese. Why not new ways to be human? You know, in the West, we talk a lot about the human condition when we're looking at art or film, or when we ask these questions about what is the good life. There's a difference between saying what is it to be human, what is it to be Chinese. Does that sense of exceptionalism somehow rig the game beforehand or limit the imaginative horizons of the people who are asking these questions?
I guess I'm speaking as an academic when I say I'm afraid that the China Dream will become a zombie concept. I guess I'm afraid because it's the title of my book, and I don't want my book to no longer be relevant. But more seriously, the China Dream is actually, as I try and express in the book, is it's a very rich concept. There's a lot of possibility in thinking of how people use it to think about China's future, and it's just kind of a shame that if it becomes tainted with this kind of officialese sense. Now, I'm sure that people in China will just come up with a different way of talking about the future and a different way of giving a kind of their own critique of China's condition. But it's just unfortunate that they have to keep reinventing the wheel, keep reinventing these concepts whenever there's a new leadership. Chinese exceptionalism. There's this interesting book by Gloria Davies where she talks about patriotic worrying, and she looks at the top theorists in China. So it's a very theoretical book, much more theoretical than mine is. And one of her conclusions is that the way that these intellectual life works in China is that it's sort of the moral duty of Chinese intellectuals to save China. It's been that way for about 100 years. So you have national humiliation, national extinction, as they talked about 100 years ago, and then you have national salvation. So intellectuals are still thinking in those terms. And what Davies concludes is that this actually limits their horizon of thinking to just Chinese and not to the human condition. And that it's just about saving China, not about saving the world. Now, you can say this is a positive or a negative thing, but it's a very interesting analysis, and I generally agree with it, except I think in the past 5 years, things have moved on, that China is not just trying to save China, it's trying to save the world, but it's trying to save the world in a particularly Chinese way. So Chinese exceptionalism isn't just about Chinese internal politics, it's about spreading the Chinese way, the kind of Chinese moral universe to the world, and that the world should be happy to receive this. I mean, the same way that we Americans often are surprised that people don't like it when we kind of tell them what to do. The Chinese are also surprised that they get a kind of pushback.
Okay, well, we have microphones on either side, and if you could raise a hand, I think I promised you the first question next time around. Is that right? Can we go, Teddy, we go right up front, please?
My name is Arnold Zeitlin, and I teach in Guangzhou. And this is not so much a question as a comment, because I've just come back from Guangzhou, and my friends at Southern Weekly tell me that initially they were quite thrilled when President Xi remarked about the China Dream, because they had been using this as a theme for some time. But now they have decided that they better not use it at all. They don't want to be identified with that kind of China Dream. And I think, too, that many analysts have been a little bit tricked by the similarity of the concept or the title, American Dream and China Dream, because it seems to me the China Dream is much more comparable to the American concept of manifest destiny rather than the individualist China Dream. So that's basically all I have to say. Thank you.
So are you saying that the Southern Weekly is not going to give out China Dreamer Awards anymore?
I'm not sure, but they told me that they're not going to use that anymore. They were quite.
Well, yeah, I'm not, that's fascinating. Thank you for telling me that. That's, I think, very important.
I
That,
mean, we had lunch together.
yeah,
They made a point of saying that.
yeah.
Whether they'll give out the awards, I really don't know. I'll ask and I'll find out.
Yeah, please do. I'd love to hear about that.
That sounds like maybe a harbinger of zombification, perhaps.
Yeah, well, they just want to. They don't want to go there anymore. They'll come up with something else.
Michael?
Thank you. I think that sort of your question about why Chinese dream and not human, and so on, really relates to something fairly deep in Chinese culture. And the late Lucian Pye once put it very pithily, saying that China is a civilization pretending to be a state. And in Chinese history, one could argue that the country has been as much divided as it has been united over the millennia. And this question of Chinese intellectuals having to sort of save China, resuscitate it, revive it, and so on, is very ancient. You find it in sort of quite often in Chinese history. I think the last example was in the 19th century with the Qing and the attempt to revive it, and it was done in a sort of Confucianist sort of way. And then with the early nationalism, there's the idea that China could somehow or other disappear and had to be saved. And I think for the Chinese communist leaders, for them it's as much about the survival of the Communist Party, which they have done a great deal to try and say is equivalent to China. And most of their museums about history so somehow bring the two together all the time. And one of Xi Jinping's first statements that we know about after he became president was to warn the army not to go in the way of the Soviet army, to remain a party army, otherwise China could go the way of the Soviet Union. So there is this, I think, a fear that is in the top leadership about their capacity to stay in power. And in this sense, there's also a fear that they are less connected with Chinese society than they used to be. There are quite a number of writings of that kind, and if you talk to leading Chinese academics, they will say that as well. And so I think it's not just about China, it's about the survival of the regime. And I think it relates to an anxiety that comes out in quite a lot of the leaders' speeches.
Yeah, well, thank you, Professor Yehuda. I mean, that's I agree. But I would also say that when I look at the public intellectuals, there seems to be something else going on, that a lot of the public intellectuals, especially the new leftists, are about maintaining the party state and not maintaining socialism in China. But I noticed that they seem to be shifting a little to talking about identifying themselves with China as either a nation or as a culture rather than just with the party. So that this is where they give more of a critique of the party state, because they're not there just to support the party state or even direct the party state and push the party state in the direction they want. They're more interested in what is good for China. And this is where their views and their approach overlaps with the dissidents. So the dissidents are more, of course, more interested in what is good for China than what is good for the party state. Yes. Yeah. No, I think you're right.
Yes. If you could maybe pass the mic just forward in the middle here.
Hi. I think, first of all, thank you. I really enjoyed the talk, and it all sounds fascinating. One of my favorite harmonizing shifts was when things get censored online, and they tend to be described as they have been harmonized, which I think is hilarious. But more to, I really want to jump on the end of what you were saying about the expansion of Chinese kind of mentality beyond their borders. I mean, we are talking about 中国, right? And that the 中 is kind of indicative of how they view themselves in the global community. And I just wanted to ask you, what do you think that mentality, as China looks beyond its borders, will mean for their neighbors, both in Southeast Asia and Central Asia, where they, as an energy-hungry nation, have started to look, Kazakhstan and so forth?
I didn't put it in this presentation, but for another paper and presentation I'm doing, I don't compare the American dream and the China dream as much as talking about China dream and what is increasingly called the world dream, the Xi Jinping Xiang. And this, again, is a very new discourse. It arose, you can date it pretty much to April, when the kind of propaganda campaign for the China Dream came out. And in official, like the People's Daily, by these sort of official these names that actually are not people, but it's just a collective of official views, started talking about the China Dream and the world dream, and how China's dream is the world's dream, and the world will welcome the China Dream, and things like that. And this harkens back a little to the 2008 Olympics, where they talked about one world, one dream. That was a slogan, which at the time was still controversial. So it's underlying this notion of unity, that the goal, the political goal, is not diversity, but the political goal is unity, both at the domestic and at the international level. And some of the public intellectuals that I was analyzing started using traditional Chinese concepts to define the world dream. So it's, Tianxia, the all under heaven, or Datong, the great harmony, and Tianxia Taiping, that sort of thing. And very directly pointing to the traditional Chinese world order of China at the center, and around the periphery are the tributary states. And so within China, this is, it's kind of popular to say this, and it's growing in influence. It's not necessarily the policy, but this is the way intellectuals are talking about it. Now, outside China, in Southeast Asia, I was in Singapore for a year last year, so I talked to a lot of people in the region, and they are, kind of worried about this view, this Chinese exceptionalist view of China at the center of the world, and that they are at the periphery. Even, Xi Jinping gave a speech 2-3 weeks ago about regional diplomacy, and he says that we not only have to strengthen economic ties, we have to spread them out to security ties. We don't just have to have security ties, we have to have shared norms and shared beliefs. And my sense is that these shared norms and these shared beliefs are this sort of traditional Chinese world order way of thinking of things. And I'm pretty sure that in Southeast Asia, it's not going to be welcomed much. They won't necessarily criticize it publicly, but there is a certain uneasiness. So I was very kind of struck by how in Singapore and in Thailand and in other countries, they are very happy to deal with China. There's a lot of economic benefits to dealing with China, but they're also cultivating new relations with India, and as well as reaffirming their relations, their security relations with the U.S. So it seems that a lot of the officials and intellectuals in Southeast Asia are really, just doing a traditional hedging strategy to deal with this rise of China.
up front here in the red, and then over to you, sir. One, 1, 2, and then we'll move over this way.
Thank you, Professor, for the speech. I really enjoyed it. I'm an intern reporter from China Daily, and I'm interested in your notion of China expressing itself in the world by the harmony theory. Because in China, we don't only have the harmonious society inside China. We want also, as the president said, we want to create a harmonious world. So what do you think of this this message to the world, to the outside world? What does the foreigners' perception of this notion, and do you think this is in some way correlates with the communist internationalism, or it's just a way of China nowadays want to embrace the world more, to open up to the world? Thanks.
Well, I mean, Harmonious World was first kind of launched by Hu Jintao in 2005 at the United Nations. And the way he talked about it there was this very broad aspirations for equal societies and kind of traditional Chinese foreign policy language of mutual benefit, mutual respect. But he also said that that he wanted to have a harmonious world of different civilizations. And for me, that seemed to be a starting point for people within China to talk about alternative world orders, kind of not the Westphalian nation state kind of world order, but this, what I keep talking about, this Tianxia system kind of world order. So whether it's the philosopher Zhao Tingyang or the IR specialist Yan Xuetong, they all started looking to the classics in on or about 2005. Now, the world, I can't speak on behalf of the world's reaction to it, except to say that I don't think many people outside China know much about Harmonious World. It hasn't been successful in kind of becoming a new concept outside China, or a meaningful concept outside China. So I don't think it's been very successful that way. Whereas things like China Dream and now World Dream, a lot more people are paying attention to that. I think it's because, at least from an American point of view, it sounds more familiar. Even though, as I've hopefully shown, the dreams, and as you've said too, the dreams work in very different ways, very different objectives. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I'm Victor Bass, your consultant in national security policy. What seems to be emerging is competition between the United States and China for leadership in the world. Now, we have certain ideals, certain concepts which have eternal value, like freedom, human rights, and others. What is it that China has to offer for this leadership of the world? Well, we do have something to offer, and we know that. You mentioned harmony, but you also mentioned the fact that at one time it was ridiculed too. Nobody ever ridiculed freedom or human rights. They may have been suppressed, yes, but never ridiculed.
I think that China actually has benefited a lot in the early 21st century from the unpopularity of American foreign policy, whether it was in Iraq or Afghanistan or other places. And what China was able to do is present itself as a different kind of power, a non-interventionist power, a power that respects sovereignty. And this, although this is not, this way of thinking of things is not very convincing in North America and in Europe. It's actually very popular in the rest of the world, in the global south, in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So China was able to present itself as an alternative, but not really doing that much, just saying, we're not like that. We're not like Washington. So, but what has been happening since then is China's tried to turn this sort of negative, reactive foreign policy into a more positive in the sense of having new ideas, way of thinking about the world. So it's the formula is quite simple, where, as I said, where the U.S. is for freedom and prosperity, in China it's about order and prosperity. To have prosperity, you need to have order. That's what the China model is about. It's about that you need a strong state to tame the market. And so they look at the financial crisis in the West and say, see how much trouble that caused? We weren't part of that. So they have some ideas. It's still too early to see, too early to tell how successful they'll be. And as they kind of flesh out the ideas, as I think I've shown you, these ideas of alternative world order sound great when you're saying, oh, we're not like them. But when you start saying, oh, well, we're like this, then people say, well, no, I don't really like that. Southeast Asian countries don't necessarily want to be part of a hierarchical system.
Yes, over here on the right, and then down front.
Gil Rosman, the ASAN Forum, and thanks for a terrific talk, Bill. There's one thing, though, I want to ask. Your views seem to have evolved quite a bit from the book, where you emphasize public intellectuals with different notions of the China dream, to now Xi Jinping essentially preempting that, taking over the notion. So really, what is this that Xi Jinping has done? Do we now have a single dominant China dream? And your three parts, the military, the New Left, and the Confucian dream, all seem to be three sides of the same overarching theme. A strong state creates a hierarchical world order that is strong enough militarily to become superior to the United States. And the other side is just thrown off, as you've indicated with what happened to Southern Weekly by the beginning of this year, very shortly after Xi Jinping announced his theme. So really, do we have one dominant China dream, which is not so much a dream, but as a core statement of national identity, almost an ideology, that's saying this is the way you should be thinking about China becoming the leader? And has that changed the way you're presenting your analysis if things are moving precisely in that direction?
You're telling my secrets, Gil. Thank you for your question. I think, you're right to say that I agree when you say that the kind of new official China dream from Xi Jinping and his surrogates is a combination of the military dream, the kind of new left economic dream, and the Confucian dream of world order, and that it's left out the liberals in particular. And so yes, that is my conclusion. But what I want to say is that there's still a lot of feedback and pushback and debate in China about what the China dream should be. So when I read these official statements and articles and official publications that talk about the China dream versus the American dream, for example, there's two ways of reading that, oh, well, this is it, that the party state is really enforcing this very narrow view of national identity. And certainly that's what they would like to do. But there's another way of reading these propaganda statements and articles, is that they're not as successful as they hoped. So the other way of thinking about Xi Jinping's China Dream is that it has opened up a Pandora's box of people and to encourage people to have their own dreams. So people talk about their dream house and dream of, clean air and clean water, dream of a good family life. And this is kind of this debate that's going on in China. And if you look at the official thing, you think, oh, it's all very nationalistic and very unified. But if you see that as a response to things like the Southern Weekend editorial, if you see it as a response to films, was it Tiny Times, about kind of girls gone wild in China, that is the dynamic that I'm looking at. Even though I think that the kind of the space for discussion of the China Dream is narrowing as it becomes more and more official, I still wanted to maintain that there is space for discussion of it, and that some of the discussion is still, quite interesting and very critical.
Hi, I'm Maria Ropnikova, also from the ASEAN Forum. I just have a question going back to the zombie idea about the concept of the China Dream. Just wanted to challenge that a little bit. Have you thought at all of thinking about it as a sort of tool for resistance, kind of rightful resistance, works by O'Brien, Murtha about policy entrepreneurs? The idea that maybe the concept will not be openly debated, but there are going to be individuals using it to achieve certain purposes, kind of as a shield of protection. So they might be just saying it's China Dream, but doing something very different, advocating for a local level kind of policy change, things like that. Have you thought of this evolving in that way at all?
A little, but yeah, you're right. I should look more into that, about how people use slogans, like in Jiang Zemin's 3 Represents. People use that to promote various things that he didn't really intend. So people can use the China Dream to promote environmentalism in China, for example. We'll have to see whether that happens.
Yes, sir. Right in the middle.
Sam Bateman, Foreign Commercial Service. I'd just like to ask if the concepts of creativity and entrepreneurialism are part of any official visions of the Chinese Dream. And I ask that question because I believe it's felt that those are 2 concepts that are important to the future development of China, but yet they may be, at least in some part, incompatible with a one-party government.
Well, I mean, innovation, the idea of innovation and innovation policy is really on the minds of people in Beijing right now. And as you probably know more than I do, they're trying to sort of square this circle of how to have innovation without having, say, academic freedom. Or how can you have innovation in a technical sense, but not necessarily in a political or a social sense. In statements about the China Dream, official statements about the China Dream in the past year, they usually talk about creativity and innovation being part of it, but they do it in very broad and vague terms, so I'm not sure how meaningful they are.
Bill, I wanted to ask about what seems to me to be a conflict in different kinds of discourse in
Right.
China. All of the different China Dreams that you mentioned in your book, or most of them, seem to me to share a common premise. They're all premised on national virtue narratives, which are not deeply questioned. China is posited as China the good, China the potential moral exemplar, and this is why something like a Tianxia system or a harmonized world could work. And yet, China doesn't find many people standing up and clapping and saying, what has taken you so long? It doesn't find that. And at the same time that you have this national virtue narrative and buy-in to China the good, you also have within China, you talk about the patriotic worry, many people worried about the lack of civil virtue, a collapse in morals, anger, a readiness to violence, and deep, deep dissatisfaction. So how does China reconcile this claim about what is supposed to be apparent national virtue, which nobody else buys into, and this experience of a collapse in civic virtue, which everybody else knows about. So conceptually, how do they walk on those sort of two legs at once, and is there any conflict experienced with that among the people that you've interviewed?
I think, I mean, the best way to understand Chinese discourse, or the way people are talking about things in China, is not to be distracted by contradictions, because contradictions are everywhere. And what I see going on is that there are parallel trends going on. And it's not just two trends that are the opposites, it's just different trajectories. So like the 4 China dreams that I mentioned in my presentation, those are all going on at the same time, and sometimes they cross over, sometimes they share things, sometimes they're criticizing each other. And I think that you have to be able to, or I have to be able to sort of suspend disbelief, or suspend this kind of sense that, oh, this is contradictory, or how can you do all these things at the same time? Because that doesn't seem to be the mindset of what's going on. And I mean, in some ways, you can describe it, I can describe it in familiar terms. So Xi Jinping, in December of last year, after he gave his speech about the China Dream, he went around to various constituencies, and he did sort of not pre-election campaigning, but post-election campaigning. So he went to the military and said, yeah, military China Dream. And he went to Shenzhen, where his father was the kind of pioneer in economic liberalization in the 1980s. He says, yeah, economic reform, that's great. And then he goes to rural areas and says, yeah, rural stuff, good. So he was going around to different constituencies and saying he's on their side, and the China Dream is part of their, will take care of them. And even though each of these things might be in contradiction with each other, that doesn't seem to be a problem for the way the leadership is thinking about things. Now, we could say it just is pushing off the problems to down the road, but these contradictions have been part of the whole economic reform process for the past, 33, 34 years. And there have been some, big problems in China, but they haven't sort of derailed the whole project yet.
Okay, thank you. Other questions or comments? I know we have, yes?
With the microphone or without?
Well, you're doing fine without. There's a microphone just to your right if you'd like to use it.
Hi, my name's Mike Pillsbury, and I brought you a free book. It's called China Debates the Future Security Environment. It's one of about 20 books that you are now adding 3 more to. Gil Rosman has, I don't know how many, 5. David Shambaugh has about 4. It's the effort of American scholars and government people to try to parse what you're doing. Public writings versus what the government of China says or thinks. And I've noticed, and all of us, we struggle with what it means when you're using the term, which I want to disagree with you. You're using the term public intellectual. You use it several times today. It's in your writings. And in America, that means, to me, somebody who's the editor of the New York Review of Books or a professor at the University of Maryland. It doesn't mean the Secretary of Defense or a White House staffer who's under discipline and must, within certain reasonable limits, reflect the government. But these public intellectuals you're quoting, I've met all of them. And Zhao Tingyang was here in town just a couple of weeks ago. In fact, Bob Daley was a speaker at this